This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Cheek to the cold floor, thick sole on my back, I began to sense my place in this moment in history. I had thought I was playing the hero, arriving just in time to save my mom, when I was put in a chokehold, thrown to the ground and tasered in the groin. I didn't realize, I heard myself croak. I just want to see my mom. The shoe pressed harder. She can't be saved, son, said its voice, not unkindly. Then it stomped the wind out of me. How did we get here? Life shuttered, shop gates down, planes grounded, government offices not answering the phone. Yellow caution tape wrapped around jungle gyms. Guards using tasers on soccer moms, pastors, and bereaved sons. I saw it coming, and yet it all happened so fast. Half the inhabitants of Earth under house arrest. I'm still in awe. It is really quite impressive. If 9/11 was the prologue, this is the main event. And once again, I find myself listed in the dramatis personae. In 2008, when Gertrude, my 9/11 widowed mother, remarried, I put on the mask of Manic Hamlet to tell that story. The other shoe has finally dropped. 12 years later, I am cast in Orwell's Nightmare. I take control of the role of Winston Smith in first person, so that I can override his author and change his depressing ending. A lonely accordion in the far distance starts a bittersweet tune, approaching closer and closer. Soon, instruments join in. A guitar, a trombone. An impromptu band has formed and begins parading in the square. All at once, the crowd begins singing, hands on hearts, faces tilted to the sky. Jumpsuited, outer party members break into pairs and start waltzing. Soon, the whole street crowd is in choreographed motion. They sing, "Lockdowns and restrictions, nonsense by prescription." The inner party members are helpless to stop it. Nous devons continuer à danser encore. When a few of the police patrols join in, the inner party members know it's all over for them. The people have won the day. Winston will not accept Big Pharma into his heart as Lord and Savior, and he will not be shot through the head in the end. But we aren't there yet. Late June 2020 in Soho, downtown New York City, the smell of burning tires from 2 nights previous lingered, and occasional police horns whooped and booped at the few leftover BLM protesters who still wandered the streets. I wondered if the police would set another gas-soaked, junked cruiser out to be sacrificed for good visuals. Glass and garbage were strewn everywhere in the deserted city. As I rounded the corner to my street, I saw that the glass front of my apartment building, a new high-rise called Victory Mansions, had been covered with plywood in anticipation of more night riots. Someone had already plastered the boards over with posters which depicted an enormous bespectacled face, more than a meter wide, the face of a man about 65 with a downturned smile, an unsettling look of self-satisfaction. In the lobby, I found that the elevator was again unresponsive to the button, and I began to trek up to the 9th floor loft. On each landing, I noticed that the same poster had been glued to the stairwell wall. "Big Pharma is watching you," the caption beneath it ran. The loft was owned by a guy, let's call him Charrington, who wanted to run to the country to get away from the riots and the harsh lockdown measures. I needed a place in the city for my new job at the public library. We agreed to swap homes for a few months. I met him on the farm and toured the gardens with him. He wore a white suit, red tie, and a straw hat. I think it might have been a Truman Capote tribute. His hair was freshly dyed black and his bushy eyebrows were grotesquely dark and false. I wondered how he would fit in Amenia. "Hello, Winston," said a woman's voice when I entered the loft. Charrington had programmed Alexa's greeting with my name as a well-intended but creepy gesture. I did not respond, though it was sometimes hard to suppress my automatic reply. Charrington had let me know that I could ask her anything about the apartment. "Alexa, where's the recycling bin? Alexa, how do you turn off the heat? Alexa, where does Charrington hide his porn?" And so on. He explained that I just had to say her name and she switches on. When I pointed out that she would have to always be on and listening in order to respond to her name, he contradicted me. But I let it go. Once inside the apartment, I double-locked the door behind me and walked to the bank of windows that looked out towards Broadway. If Alexa was always on in the background, attached to security cameras and sensors, there was a chance you were being watched at any moment. It was not inconceivable that AI monitored everybody all the time. There would be money in the national security budget for that. But, at any rate, if AI picked up a key term, it could start recording for later analysis. If this all hadn't come to pass quite yet, it was possible now, finally, to imagine a time when you lived according to a habit turned instinct, as if your every sound was overheard, your every move, gesture, and facial expression were being scrutinized. If you were one of those persons of interest, I imagine you already lived that way. Persons of interest fell into pretty broad categories: suspected terrorists, truthers, whistleblowers, people who took vitamins, people who had doubts about the state of our democracy, people who omitted the "under God" phrase in the pledge, as well as those who said it all too passionately, and anyone who grew vegetables or owned a pressure canner. For example, Gertrude. I did have an old habit of talking aloud to myself, which was probably not wise in the present circumstances. So far, Alexa had just listened in silence, and I never asked for her help. On Broadway below, protests had been going on for about 4 days. I didn't mind being in the thick of it. I marched along with the maskless throng on the first day. At least the BLM protesters gave us some reprieve from thinking about the pandemic night and day. My only worry was that the financial forces in the world were trying to effect a color revolution so that we would all kill each other so that they didn't have to kill us. In the distance, I noticed a small drone dipping in and between and around the buildings, skirting around the apartment, and zipping over to scan the rooftops and alleys. It was probably looking to identify violators of the 8 p.m. curfew. Below me, I saw a small figure dressed all in black, hooded, masked, carrying a roll of posters, a paintbrush, and a bucket of glue. When he noticed a "Big Pharma is watching you" poster, he studied it for a while, and then unrolled one of his posters and began to cover the rival's work. I recognized his poster, a multicolored list of obvious truisms which copied the yard signs in suburbs upstate. The list wasn't at all like the declarations: war is peace, freedom is slavery, or ignorance is strength, and so forth, but they did contain a germ of doublethink. Each statement, obvious and true on its face, evoked its opposite insofar as it functioned as a kind of rebuttal. Love is love, women's rights are humans' rights, no human is illegal. I believe this, virtuously accused some unnamed person of not believing that. I considered that the newer slogans in this Nicene Creed strove to be as powerful as that ironic understatement in the center of the list: Black Lives Matter, but the author of the new tacked-on slogans had failed to appreciate what had made the theme of the protest so powerful, and so the collection of new slogans that the hooded figure was now pasting to the wall undermined the one good one. I then considered that the center phrase, "Science is real," did seem to stand out, not just because its brevity allowed the font to be relatively large, but because one would only say that about Santa or God. It actually achieved some measure of Orwellian doublethink. The institutions of empiricism were reduced to Peter Pan propaganda, urging us to believe that science is real, just like we must believe fairies are real. Science doesn't require belief at all. Science has nothing to do with belief, I muttered aloud. That Disney sentiment was ushering in a new attitude towards science that would wholly undermine it, putting skeptical inquiry under suspicion and landing us in a new dark age. I turned from the window and sat on a bright red love seat. I retrieved from my pocket a recent purchase, a blank booklet that I had made on my long walk home from work, 40-some-odd blocks. During the enduring lockdown, Ubers were rare. Subways were so empty it was dangerous to go into them in the evening. So I walked through the mostly deserted streets as the sun set and the curfew began, merely hoping for a cab that would never come. Along the way, I had passed a small stationery shop in the West Village that was open. The warm glow in its windows, toward which I was moth-like drawn, cheered up the otherwise empty, dark, damp, crooked street. Paper and pen were not considered essential items, so I surmised that the old lady, staring placidly behind the counter, was some sort of libertarian rebel illegally doing business. A bell tinkled when I opened the door, and she assumed an expression of polite readiness. I realized just then that of course I would have to buy something. After pacing slowly through the cramped tiny store, looking at charming writing tools of a bygone era, I picked up a hand-sewn little brown leather booklet with about 100 blank pages of fine paper, smooth, creamy paper, designed to appear yellowed by age. $30 seemed quite a lot to pay for it, but that's what the handwritten sticker on the back said. I pulled out a 50, and the old woman made small talk as she made change from an envelope that she withdrew from under the counter without charging me any tax. As I later sat on Charrington's garish love seat and examined the blank pages of the little book, I thought about the intrepid shop owner with dyed auburn frowsy hair and a necklace of glasses on her breast. She reminded me, I realized, of the grade school English teacher I had had so many years ago, before Gertrude took me out of school. I have never forgotten her, Mrs. I smoothed the booklet on my lap and clicked my pen. I had bought the booklet to get out my thoughts about Gertrude's death. I realized, as I faced a blank, for days I had been preparing myself for this moment. I decided to start with the year, 2020. A sense of helplessness descended. To whom am I writing? Who is my audience? Shall I preach to the choir, rile up all those who already know that something is very amiss? Or should I try to reach the ones that are under the spell, the terrorized, the PTSD'd, the gloved multi-maskers who still fall asleep every night thinking there's a good chance they may drown in their own fluids before sunrise? Must I write to the future, when many of those would-be readers will have sadly ventilated or vaxxed themselves out of existence? Surely, I must write to you in the present, despite our lack of critical distance, if I want to stop that future from happening. But how? What tone do I take? Dear reader, who are you? What do you fear? What do you understand? What makes your head buzz with indignation? How do I slip through your filters? With what camouflage should I deck out my words? Shall I mimic your peer group, infiltrate your subconscious, where I might subtly rearrange your patterns of thought with poetry and raw emotion? Or, if I invite you into my mind, will you accept? Are you able to stand in my shoes and watch with my eyes as I remember the alien scene of Gertrude's swollen body arched unnaturally with a tube shoved down her throat? Are you willing to feel the helplessness I felt when I couldn't open that damn door, that damn sliding glass door, separating me from my dying mother? Mom, I yelled, slapping the glass. If she could just hear my voice, she would pull herself out of her morphine nightmare. It was then that the guards came shouting something about masks, while my mother was dying alone. I did not care about the damn mask rules. The more arbitrary the rule, the more mercilessly it is enforced. The nurses advanced cautiously with the guards. They were wearing flimsy paper ponchos and plastic face shields, which protected them from nothing, not even their fears. The guards were not PP'd up, only wearing surgical masks. They were sizing me up like dog catchers. That terrified me. It honestly did. Have you ever been looked at like that? At that moment, it crystallized. Everything was horribly wrong. The world had gone horribly, horribly wrong. Essential workers are heroes. You have to respect them. The hero label is a useful contrivance to get young men to die in wars for oil, or get them to shut up upon return about some of the unseemly actions they may have had to perform. The more ribbons you pin on them, the less likely they are to confess to the rapes and child murders, so as to not disappoint the parade goers, flag wavers, and such. Is it so, too, for the frontline nurses and doctors, the COVID heroes? But when the operation is over, these soon-to-be vaccinated heroes, like depleted uranium-sickened Iraqi war vets, will become an unwieldy burden on the system, and they, too, will be thrown aside. I had noticed that most of the media fuss in March 2020 was about protecting the medical workers from the patients, not treating the patients per se. That didn't seem right. It was as if the virus's victims themselves were just the extras in this COVID-19 movie. They had no lines and their names didn't appear when the credits rolled at the end, just the body count. Oh, but I am overgeneralizing based on my one bad experience. Undoubtedly, there were many good nurses who objected when the ventilators were wheeled in before they were needed. Undoubtedly, there were doctors who prescribed drugs off-label, searching for the cure, but those scenes have been edited from the final cut that made it to cable TV. I'm not allowed to hear about them. Thought crime is real. Yesterday, desperate to talk to someone, I recklessly tested out my library coworkers when they expressed their condolences. I asked, Since when are hospitals offered $39K to put patients on ventilators? The amazing reply was, that's the one good thing about this pandemic. Finally, the government is paying for our health care. Down with Big Pharma. She died alone. No one held her hand. With a DNR order in place, no one entered the ICU chamber. The nurses watched her data remotely as she flatlined. Another statistic appeared in the Worldometer data, one that would alter a distant decimal place on the average age of victims, going from 78.999998 to 78.999997. After registering the death, the nurses turned their attention back to uploading their dance video to YouTube, just as I came running down the hall. Later, I saw said video of the two-stepping medical professionals that was recorded while my mother's heart was slowing to a stop. Hundreds of videos, just like that one, showing automatons doing their awful clockwork dance, recorded the mass formation psychosis that had sprouted around the globe, like mold in the dark of the lockdowns. Because I hadn't been able to make an international call on my phone while I was stuck in transit, no family members were calling for Gertrude. With no one trying to visit, the hospital must have assumed she had no one to advocate for her. I wondered if they had simply drugged Gertrude straight off so that she never even knew what they were doing to her body. She would have been afraid, very afraid. I don't want to think of her frightened like that alone. It was too horrible to think about. I couldn't write about that. I was not ready to face that. I put the booklet away.
That was an excerpt from the novel Covid-1984, the musical, written by V.N. Alexander and narrated by Charlie Besso.
Today we have V.N. Alexander in our studio for the fourth time, and this happens to be our 150th episode. Welcome back, Tori.
Hi. Congratulations, 150. That's something. I'm really honored to be back.
Well, I'm glad you are. Now, one of our earlier episodes featuring your work was an excerpt from your 2015 novel, Locus Aminus, which is a modern-day take-up on Shakespeare's Hamlet, featuring a young man as the narrator. And this excerpt from your not-yet-published new novel mentioned that book, a bit of metafiction, you might say. So this novel is apparently a sequel. Tell us a little about that.
Well, I like the narrative voice and the setting that I'd created for Locus Aminus, and I wanted to continue writing that world.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the plot is just the canvas, and the real art is how the story is told. So I'd been considering different Shakespeare plots for the sequel, but when the COVID lockdowns hit, Orwell's novel sort of forced itself on me.
Mm.
In the beginning, the narrator explains that he's putting on a mask to tell the story, and he sometimes comments on the strangeness of the fact that his life seems to follow the plots of fictional worlds.
We just heard an excerpt from early in the book. Without any spoilers, can you give us a summary of the rest of the plot?
Well, I will tell you that I depart from Orwell in some significant ways. A real low point in 1984 is when Winston and Julia tell O'Brien that they'd be willing to commit acts of terrorism to overthrow the party. You become what you hate.
Mm.
My Winston is not bitter or broken. He's not so blinded by fear. Orwell may have intended his novel as a warning to society to resist totalitarian regimes, but his depressing ending when Winston accepts Big Brother could actually enable that kind of outcome, like predictive programming. So I set out to find a happy ending somehow.
The atmosphere you establish here in the beginning of the book is quite bleak and dystopian.
Mm-hmm.
Does that tone carry through the rest of the book?
Along with that, maybe tell us how that mood fits with the title, COVID-1984, the musical.
Yes, the musical is tacked on there to let readers know it's a dark comedy. It's important not to take oneself too seriously, you know. It does begin with a sense of foreboding. After all, 2020 was a very scary time for the whole world. It was terrifying. But it was also absurd. Reality was altered beyond recognition in some cases, and logic was inverted in a kind of double-think way that really triggered my gallows humor.
Is there actually any music to go along with it? Is it headed for Broadway?
I don't know, maybe. They made ragtime into a musical. So the idea of calling my story a musical came to me when I was watching videos of the danser en cours movement that swept across Europe. People in America didn't really hear about it, I guess. But during the lockdowns, a small group of French performers would go into public places, train stations and parks, and start playing instruments and singing and dancing, protesting the authoritarianism that was just getting started at the time. And at first there would just be, a few people singing, but gradually others would join in, and then suddenly the whole crowd was infected with this joyous rebellion, and everyone was dancing and singing on the train platforms and in the streets. In real life, this actually happened. It was weird, inspiring, and it was unreal, just like a musical.
Yeah, I saw those. That was
So
great.
as I was watching these videos, as a joke, I put in the comment section, hey, it's COVID-19, the musical. And a light went on in my head because I'd been wanting to revision Orwell in a positive way. And I found the tone, like a surreal tone. Not campy, though. Weird.
Yep.
There are about 5 actual music scenes in the book. One you just heard where Winston is wistfully imagining a happy ending. Then there's a reference to the line dancing that the nurses and doctors were doing while Winston's mother, Gertrude, lay dying in a COVID ward. And there are references later to the many, many musical-style commercials promoting the vaccine in 2020 in the media, in real life, which were in really bad taste and not funny, in my opinion. And late in the novel, I pay homage to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. It's a favorite musical of mine. What a shame it is that the sexual deviance of a transvestite like Tim Curry is normalized today and might fit in at a school board meeting. In the very end, there is actual music. There is an actual sheet of music on the final page, in fact. Winston makes up some cathartic lyrics to go with Chopin's Funeral March, which is a fucking great piece of music that Bugs Bunny completely ruined. So in the final scene, the metafictional stage set comes back into focus, and after a while, the funeral march picks up the tempo until it's more like Irish wake music, and the dancing mourners carry the symbolic corpses of the old, corrupt political system to the graveyard. Oof, said one of my friends when I told her what music I'd picked for the ending. Chopin's Funeral March.
You've chosen to step outside the mainstream narrative about the COVID experience. A lot of authors would hold back because they're worried about rejection or even backlash. What are your thoughts on that?
Talk about questioning the nature of reality. We have always had differences of opinion, but in 2020, we saw the beginning of entirely different realities. I think I'm just doing what artists are supposed to do, questioning the mainstream narrative.
I didn't visit New York City at all during those COVID years, but I've heard from quite a few people about how bleak and strange it was. Did you spend time there during the lockdowns and riots?
I was in Russia, St. Petersburg, during the lockdowns. That's why my reality is so different from those in the Western world. The Russians didn't trust their government at all. The government tried to lock down, but the people just weren't having it. The streets and parks were filled with people every day, all day and night. Neighbors met up in the corner apothecary shops to try to figure out what the best preventative treatments were. They have the sense that they need to depend on each other, and they can't depend on government for any kind of help. So everyone was popping D3 and zinc and getting lots of exercise. No one wore masks. It was a different world than the one that everyone experienced here. And I returned to New York the day after the June riots started.
The novel is not yet published. I presume you've encountered resistance from mainstream publishers?
When I was a young writer, I envied those writers supported by PEN America who were writing under brutal regimes. I figured censorship fosters imaginative, world-changing fiction. So, hey, it's a dream come true. Be careful what you wish for.
Yes.
Well, some people might have considered those years had an Orwellian aspect, but that seems to have moved into the past. Maybe our present is more like Huxley's Brave New World. Somebody said Orwell feared they wouldn't let us read. Huxley feared we would no longer want to, or something like that. What do you think?
People may be reading plenty of nonfiction and listening to informational podcasts these days, but they're not reading much fiction, and maybe that's the problem. But the loss of freedom and privacy that's normalized with every new emergency doesn't get rolled back. That's why this book is a sequel. The story is cumulative. We still have the TSA groping our groins, after all. And the censorship could get worse with the TikTok ban and the upcoming Supreme Court decision on Missouri v. Biden. The First Amendment could actually go. By the way, I don't think that billionaire bought free speech for us, Elon Musk, is in fact the model for my O'Brien character. He seems like he might be one of those inside party members who cares about your freedom.
Ah, yes, he's a lovely lad.
I think of Musk as the new Henry Ford character in E.L. Dr. Rose Ragtime, which is another really important influence for this novel.
Your characterization of people's eagerness to accept what the media told them without questioning it matched my experiences then. Do you think there's been any improvement in the years since?
Well, the dumb hicks didn't listen. They were more like the Russians. In Locus Aminus, I made fun of the rural hicks in my town of Amenia. In the sequel, they got to be the heroes. My faith is in the proles now.
The Charrington character is rather odd and striking, and probably not a good fit for the small rural town of Amenia. Does he play a role in the story later?
I was following Orwell when I wrote that sinister character in, and I didn't really have any special plans for him, but I was pleasantly surprised when he just popped up later at the Wasaic School for Feeble-Minded Children, where I located Orwell's infamous torture chamber, Room 101. In the Harlem Valley, I don't know if you know this, we had one of the most disgusting eugenic sites in the country, sad to say, right in my little town. That historical detail ended up working well with my theme and plot.
I'm getting the impression of an underlying theme here. Something about the differences in our response to fear.
Fear makes people do terrible things. Scapegoating, for example. So don't be afraid. Your neighbors are not your enemies.
Another bit of metafiction you used is when Winston is trying to write in his little blank book, and he was asking the questions that you, as the author of this book, must have asked. Dear reader, who are you? How do I slip through your filters? With what camouflage should I deck out my words?
I had planned to do as I had done in Locus Aminus, where I sort of pretended initially to be writing the official narrative, and then slowly introduced disrupting details. But I realized my narrator, having lived through 9/11, was already too cynical to be taken in by COVID. So I asked the reader to jump right into the mind of a conspiracy theorist. Why not? There's a long list of anti-heroes in great literature, right?
Yes.
But I am hoping that a literary narrative can open minds in ways that nonfiction simply can't. I've been reading Ian McGilchrist this month. According to him, literary poetic writing and contextualization is mainly processed in the right hemisphere. Apparently, the left hemisphere, dedicated to speech production or turning thought into digital symbolic code, is mechanistic and utilitarian. It can stick to the rules even to the point of absurdity. Confirmation bias deepens on the left side.
Yeah, he's a very interesting and erudite person. I have The Master and His Emissary and The Matter with Things, 2 giant volumes. I think he's of the opinion that overvaluation of the left hemisphere doesn't bode well for civilization.
Yeah, I like him a lot. You did an interesting thing as you were writing this novel. You shared it with your Facebook followers, chapter by chapter, and asked for feedback. I can't really imagine doing that. I don't want people to read my work until it's polished and shiny. So how did that work for you?
I did that just to make myself get it done. I imposed an artificial deadline by promising to post a new chapter every week. The response was all positive. No one said, you should do this or that, so it didn't interfere with my vision. And once I finished, I took it all offline and started revising. But the experience taught me that there is a real hunger out there for a good story about COVID.
While you're still looking for a publisher for this book, are you working on any new writing projects?
I'm not going to start anything new until I publish this one. The publisher of my 3 novels died in 2020, and I hate having to knock on doors. My very left-wing themes that any traditional publisher would have loved a few years ago are now supposedly right-wingy somehow. So where do I go? A natural home for this book might have been Skyhorse Publishing, because they've been publishing on this topic like crazy. And I have dear friends there who appreciate my style, but they don't do fiction. That is, their COVID book department doesn't do fiction. They should, for reasons that I've noted. Now I'm also shopping it elsewhere to mainly fiction publishers, and I'll mention that Conservatarian Press is bravely considering it, as is Heresy Press. I would be delighted with any one of those 3. I also have an audiobook for my 2003 novel, Naked Singularity, that should be out in a month or so.
Well, great. Thank you, Tori, for another contribution to the Strange Recital. We'll check in again soon.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks.
Alexa, stop the recording.
We don't have Alexa.
We don't?
No.
Then who am I talking to?
I am Siri.
This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Toccata and Fugue in D minor by J.S. Bach, played by Illinois Brass Band. This is episode 24041. Who am I talking to?